18. Persecution ahead. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 to 7. Now, concerning the things whereof ye wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. The wife hath not power over her own body, but the husband. And likewise also the husband hath not power of his own body, but the wife. Defraud ye not one the other, except it be with consent for a time, that ye may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency. But I speak this by permission, and not of commandment. For I would that all men were even as myself. But every man hath his proper gift of God, one after this manner, and another after that. This entire chapter of 1 Corinthians, more than any other, has been routinely used against Paul. Modernists use it to say he was ascetic, he was anti-marriage, and so on. Those who are Bible believers often fall into the trap of apologizing for Paul and failing to see the point of what he said. Paul is not viewing sex and marriage unfavorably. To think so is to misread the text. Paul was a Jew, and Jews were very pro-marriage. Jews were very pro-family. There never have been any Jewish monks or nuns. To say that Paul views marriage unfavorably and regards celibacy as a higher estate is wrong. It is not only to misread the text, but to neglect a key phrase in verse 26. For this present distress. In other words, we have an emergency situation. In terms of that, I am counseling you. This is not for normal circumstances. Remember, too, that Paul writes this because they wrote and asked him the question, given the problems we are facing, should we marry? For this present distress, what does that mean? The word distress is a form of ananke, meaning a necessity, an emergency, created by circumstances. This places a different meaning on this entire discussion of marriage. What was the present distress or emergency? We will come to that in a minute. In the Jewish perspective, we have to recognize, and Paul was a thoroughly good and consistent Jew, every man was regarded as having a duty to marry, unless physically incapable. In the Greco-Roman view, however, things physical were regarded as amoral, having no moral consequence. A quote-unquote good man could marry and or fornicate freely, or he could remain celibate. There were many pagan ascetics who saw their separation from sex as a higher and more spiritual way. Paul rejects both of these pagan views. Celibacy can be honourable, and so too marriage. He will not therefore make it a requirement to do one or the other as the moral way. The governing phrase is, for this present distress, verse 26, for the present emergency. Our histories of the early church are incomplete. Was Corinth facing a persecution which would kill many, leave widows and orphans, and make death more difficult for Christian men? Consider, if you were arrested for your faith and you were given the choice of renouncing your faith and living, or dying and leaving your wife and your children bereft of support, and you knew that the church would do what it could to help them, but there were so many other men who were arrested and facing death, it would be a very, very difficult choice. It is one thing to be ready to die singly for the faith, another to have a wife and children, and have them helpless because of your execution for Christian belief. This is the context of this text, verses 1 to 40. It is also the context of the Corinthian church and its concern, because, as verse 1 tells us, they wrote to Paul asking his counsel in this very urgent matter. Paul's answer is in this context. Some of them are reasonably sure they're going to die, basically for the likely martyr. It is good for a man not to touch a woman, verse 1, This is going to be too difficult for you, so if you are single, stay single. Paul's Jewishness cannot be contested, and there is no asceticism in this heritage. There are no Jewish monks or nuns. What Paul is saying is simply that an informed choice is necessary for these possible martyrs. It is possible for a man to avoid marriage because one is likely to be singled out for arrest and death, or by avoiding marriage, fall into fornication. Therefore, Paul says, if you are going to fall into fornication, into sin, by staying single, marry. Let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. Verse 2. If they do marry, asceticism must be avoided. Husband and wife must render to each other the, quote, due benevolence, end quote, or sexual union. The Greek expression refers to a good given one to another, so Paul is saying, your sexual relations are a form of doing good to each other in marriage. There is no depreciation of marital sex. It is not even remotely implied. In marriage, a husband's body is in the wife's power to use, and the wife's body is in her husband's. Verse 4. To deny sex one to another is to defraud one's marriage partner. Verse 5. By consent, the couple can, for a time, give themselves to prayer and fasting, but only for a limited time. That Satan tempt you not for your incontinency. Ascetic separation can lead to sexual temptation. What is Paul talking about? First, he says that if you can't stay single, if in marriage you recognize that they might be knocking on your door to arrest you very soon because you are a Christian, don't forgo your sexual relations because of this, unless it is for a short time for fasting and prayer to pray for the church under persecution. Paul makes clear that no law of God dictates staying single before persecution, nor getting married. Verse 6. The reference here is to verse 2, whether or not one should stay single or marry. He says, this is a matter for you to decide in terms of your situation and your character. Once married, however, God's law requires a mutual obligation. The permission to marry or to stay single is exactly that, a permission. But once a man or a woman chooses one or the other, they are then obligated to be faithful to its conditions. They cannot marry and act like a monk. Obedience to God's law is always obligatory. Paul in verse 7 says that he wishes that all men were as he, single and able to stay single. Of course, Paul was somewhat older. Paul, according to Acts, consented to Stephen's death. Acts chapter 8 verse 1, chapter 22 verse 20. If this means that he voted for it in the Sanhedrin, as the text seems to indicate, it means also that Paul was either a married man or a widower, because a single man could not take part in the Sanhedrin. That was an interesting aspect of the Old Testament, of the law. Only men who were married or who were widowers could hold office or could vote, because they were responsible people with responsibility towards a wife and or children. Moreover, Paul was put in charge of an expedition to arrest Christians. This would not have been entrusted to a single man, because it was held by the Jewish believers, and on good Old Testament grounds, that a man is less responsible if he is single. Today, our law still recognizes that fact. Why? Well, a single man pays a higher automobile insurance than a married man, because it is recognized that males are less stable prior to marriage than when they assume responsibility. When Paul says, "For I would that all men were even as myself," verse 7, the context tells us that he means, like himself, unencumbered with a family to make martyrdom difficult. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 22 to 33, Paul gives us an account of his own trials, beatings and near-death experiences to illustrate what a Christian could be sentenced to. Outside the Bible, these incidents are not recorded, and so too whatever the believers in Corinth faced has gone unrecorded. It does not mean it was not a very real crisis, but History apparently didn't feel that the death of a handful of believers in Corinth was worth recording. Only when it was in great numbers that Christians were martyred do we have any record of the fact. Paul, in Acts chapter 26, verse 10, speaks of voting against Christians in Jerusalem in the Sanhedrin. He was apparently once married and is now single. This makes his ministry and potential martyrdom easier, and he wishes that all men were even as myself. Verse 7, that is, not required to make the difficult choice between marriage and non-marriage, between dying or renouncing Christ to take care of one's family. But every man hath his proper gift of God, one after this manner, and another after that. Verse 7. Some of you, as you face this possibility of death, have the proper gift of God to stay single. Others of you, marriage is your gift of God and your ability to provide and care for your family. Thus, Paul does not exalt either celibacy nor marriage. His concern is one's ability to stand and die for Christ when the time comes. The present distress, verse 26, may have been in the mind of the Corinthian believers when they wrote to Paul. Verse 1, it was no academic question, but an urgent request for God's word as they faced potential death. Both 1st and 2nd Corinthians tell us of a rather grim feeling in Corinth. As non-Christians, they would not have had to face such a crisis. But now, as new Christians, the closeness of martyrdom had an unsettling effect on them. In part, their rebelliousness was perhaps traceable to this. Their concerns opened up the whole question of marriage and divorce, and Paul, in verses 8 following, turns to such questions. Christian faith had opened up a new world of opportunities, but also of threats, and the Corinthian Christians had to be prepared to face up to them. Despite the undercurrent of resentment against Paul, the bearer of judgment and of bad news, the Corinthians still knew his importance. They asked their key questions of Paul because they know, like it or not, Paul's answers would be faithful to the mandates of Christ the King.